Okay, so we're going to get started. Today you got two handouts. You got assignment 104, which is your next actual assignment that is due. Remember, last class we got assignment 107 that's due at the end of the semester. This is the next in queue of where we're going from here. It is due on Wednesday, 3/29, which, if you do a little searching on your calendar, you'll note is right before spring break. So I'm not one of the people that likes to make you stress out over spring break, so I always try to have something due before you go on spring break. So it's due before you go away, you have a fantastic time, you relax, you get de-stressed, and you come back for the semester. By the way, that's only a couple weeks away, which is great, because then we get to go on spring break. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to spring break as much as all of you are looking forward to spring break. So this we will talk more in depth about next lecture. When we talk about color theory, I'll show a bunch of examples of Charlie Harper so that you guys can see the kinds of things that we're doing. Essentially, Charlie Harper was a graphic designer who did a lot of very flat drawings, etc., of animals and creatures and that sort of thing. It is a perfect translation into the world of Illustrator. It's basic shapes and how do you manipulate those shapes, working with color theory, etc. So it's everything that we've been talking about in class and will talk about in class. So that's coming, but I like to at least give you this so you can start thinking about it in the back of your mind, but we'll talk about it more on Wednesday. Today we're going to continue with making our own font. But before we get too much into that, I do want to talk about a few things. And the reason that I bring this up as an overall lecture topic is because at this stage of your Adobe world development, the question arises, well, wait a minute, why do I use Illustrator instead of Photoshop? And I've had a lot of students who are confused about the two, and why is one different than the other? And so we'll talk about that in the context of vector graphics versus raster graphics. And this is something that you, as graphic designers, as architectural designers, really need to have a grasp on so that you can understand when it's appropriate to use one software over another. And so we'll talk about that today. It won't go too long, and then we'll spend some time working in Illustrator on the pen tool, and you guys will finish up your fonts for today. So let's talk first about raster graphics. And raster graphics are very much photo-like graphics. And essentially what happens with a raster graphic is the raster graphic itself is made up of individual little dots that are colored. They have a specific color value, and when you zoom out far enough, you're going to see an overall image. And so when we take a digital photo through our digital camera or something like that, we talk about megapixels. How many million pixels are in this image? Well, these pixels are exactly what we're talking about. How many dots represent the photo in this particular image? But the more you zoom in, the more blurry it will become. And at some point, you can get to the individual colored squares. You've probably done this in Photoshop, where you keep zooming in, and all of a sudden it becomes these little squares. In terms of raster graphics, it definitely has some advantages. And you've seen some of those advantages in Photoshop already. We can go pixel by pixel and alter or change individual colors. So it makes manipulation really easy for a photograph. Hence why it's in Photoshop. It's easier to edit when you have complex colors. So if you think about a photograph, it's pretty easy to go through and adjust that one color, darken it up, use a little dodging and burning to darken or lighten the image. You can also apply fancy effects to the image, blending modes, those kinds of things, work really nicely in this context. What are some disadvantages of raster images? Well, you've already experienced one. When you zoom in, at some level, the image becomes blurry. So even if you had the most enormous, gigantic image file ever, at some point, you zoom in enough, it's going to get blurry. It's just the nature of the file. The other thing is that file sizes tend to be really big in association. So if we had, let's say, a gigapixel image, a really large image, that image is going to be big because the file has to contain every one of the dots and the color that every one of the dots has. Likewise, it's going to take more computer processor power, more memory to run. So if you're working in something like Photoshop, you can end up with a giant cache size and a lot of processing power being required for your image. And it can eat up space in your hard drive and your RAM and all that sort of thing. Photoshop has this nifty thing where it starts to, when your computer runs out of RAM, it starts to take space from your hard drive and temporarily use that too. And so it can balloon up to using a fair amount of space. If you're running a laptop that has a solid state drive that's on the smaller side, you can actually bump up against the capacity of the computer because of these extremely large image files. So you have to be aware of that, and that's certainly a disadvantage. Vector graphics. So we just talked about raster graphics. When we move into the world of vector graphic, it's different. This is based on a mathematical definition of shapes, lines, or curves. So if we were doing an architectural drawing, if we were drawing something that had basic shapes, instead of saying this, let's say we drew a circle. Every one of the pixels that make up this circle is a specific color. We can, in vector graphics, say, here's the center of the circle, here's the radius, draw me a circle, fill that with red. It's a very low impact formula. So a square, for example, we have 4 control points, and it doesn't even have to be a square. It could be a rectangle, it could be any other 4-sided object. You have 4 control points in space. Fill in the region that those 4 control points define. It's very, very simple, and it's mathematically driven. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Advantages, you can scale it infinitely. You can always make it larger, and it will always remain crisp, because that line that defines the difference between what is filled and what is not is a math line. You zoom in, it's still sharp. You zoom out, it's still sharp. The file sizes, consequently, are very small, too. If you think about that square, or that 4-sided object, you have a file that defines those 4 points and then says, fill in the region that's contained with those 4 points. It's very small. It's not every pixel that makes up this particular image. It's definitely also easier on the computer and the memory on the computer because it's just math. Computers are great at math. Disadvantages, on the other hand, is they're not good for photographs. So we see over here on the right, I have a photograph on the left, and then I have the vector conversion of the photograph on the right. And if we look at these two examples, right, if look, for example, under the eye at the subtlety of the shadows in the wrinkles, etc. If we look at it here, it's much more blocky. This color region, that color region. There's not a smooth definition of those wrinkles. It's much more pixelated, or I guess it's not really pixelated, it's more blocky, because we have color regions that are defined that are trying to make up this particular shape. It's not as fluid as something like the raster image on the left. So the other thing is, generally speaking, anything, anywhere can open a JPEG image. No matter where you are, chances are you can open the JPEG image. Vector graphics can be a little bit more challenging. Maybe you have an Illustrator format, maybe you have an EPS format, which is kind of a universal vector graphic file format. Maybe you have an AutoCAD file. It's a little more specific, harder to open, unless you have the specialized software that works with it. So when do we use vector versus raster, etc.? So on the raster side, anytime we're dealing with photographs, high dynamic range images, any of those, that construct, we want to be on the raster side. We want to be doing things like Photoshop or similar applications. The vector side would be things like line drawings, architectural drawings, 3D modeling, logos, defining fonts. You wouldn't want your font, for example, as you blew it up to get more and more pixelated. You always want it to be smooth. So it would have to be a vector graphic. So let's go to the next slide here, and we can see how this stuff combines together a little bit. I have an example logo here. And if we look here at the logo, we have a very small resolution. The vector graphic size, 36 kilobytes, again, very small. The bitmap size at that same resolution is 57 kilobytes, so almost twice the file size. And again, these kilobytes, I mean, this is so small it really doesn't matter at this scale. However, when we start to get it larger, 1500, notice the vector size is exactly the same. But the bitmap or raster size goes up to 2 megabytes. It's significantly larger in its file size. So for something like this logo to end up being 2 megabytes, let's imagine something far more complicated. You can see how this can snowball. If we look at the left here where we have the sample brochure, a lot of times things are combined with different, depending on what you're doing, you may combine both vector and raster graphics. So in this case, it's a little brochure. You have the logo that was done as a vector graphic. It can shrink or expand infinitely and still be sharp. The bitmap photo is fine as long as it's not blown up too much. So in this case, it would work fine. We have the type, and that's also a vector graphic. So you can combine things together, and that's where InDesign comes in, where you bring in the various parts and then do an output. So here we go. Here's another example. Same logo here. That's a vector graphic. If we zoom in on the wingtip, we see that it's still perfectly sharp as long as it's the vector graphic. If we converted it to the raster image and we zoomed in the same percentage, you can see the pixels that represent that endpoint. So there is a distinct difference. So computer programs fall into basically two categories, the ones that we're using. We have the raster programs, which are things like Photoshop, GIMP, photo editing programs. And then we also have things like V-Ray, a rendering engine that generates a JPEG image. So anything that's generating a JPEG image or manipulating a JPEG or a photographic file are going to be on the raster side. The vector side, on the other hand, are going to be things like Illustrator. InDesign's kind of a weird one, because really InDesign is a layout tool. Technically, it's vector-based. You have a container, you have a frame, you put the image into that frame. That frame is defined by a vector graphic, the four sides. But it's kind of a hybrid because you're bringing in the other types. So I don't know. It's technically a vector program, but it's not necessarily as obvious. Illustrator is pretty obvious. AutoCAD, good example. Math-based. You're drawing in full scale, and then you scale it down. It's never jagged. Vectorworks, Revit, Rhino, a lot of the architectural design programs, a lot of the 3D modeling programs are all going to be like this. 3D Studio Max, SketchUp, technically speaking, they're vector-based, but they're kind of a little different in terms of how they interpret 3D modeling data. But we can lump them into the same vector-based category. OK, so we're going to stop here. Hopefully you have a better understanding now of vector versus raster graphics and why we emphasize Illustrator over Photoshop or Photoshop over Illustrator, depending on what we do. We're going to move computers, so bear with me for a second, and then we'll continue on with our exercise 114 and our fonts. OK, so I'm going to go ahead, now that I've switched over computers, I'm going to open up Illustrator. And I'll open up the file that I created last class. So with Illustrator open, we'll go ahead and go to the File menu. I'll go to Open. And I'm going to go find the most recent. I think this was it. Sorry, wrong one. Wrong date. Oh, it's script template. That's what it is. There we go. Sorry. So I had to get the right file. Obviously, I had files from last class. So I went ahead and I finished up the letters. And I went all the way down there. There's a few letters at the bottom here that I didn't do. I would like you to finish all of the letters down to the optional letters. So everything to this line should be done. The optional letters are up to you. Obviously, I threw in the ampersand down there because I think it's a useful character. But it's up to you. Minimum, I want this upper section fill so that you have a sense for all the letters and you've practiced with your pen tool so that you feel comfortable. And that's really the idea of it. But before we get too far into it, I want to show you a few other options that are available to you as part of this design. And I mentioned them briefly last class. And that is something called the Shape tool, which can help customize your letters a bit. So let me zoom in on, say, the B, for example. And if I was working with the B here, I can use this tool over here, which looks kind of like a, I I don't know, a weird curly line with a diagonal across it. It's called the width tool. And that width tool, essentially what it does is it will allow me to control the width at various points on my line. So for example, down here at the bottom or in this part of the B, if I were to click and hold, I can deliberately make the B fatter in that location. I can also make the B thinner in a different location. So I can really change the look of my particular letter depending on where I control the various points. So I can make that a little bit thinner, etc. So I can make that. It's again infinitely smooth. So the more times I zoom in, it's still smooth. If I zoom out here, we can go back. The other thing that's available to you, instead of doing it manually, you can also select your line. You can come over to your stroke. And down here at the bottom, there's something called profile. And there are a bunch of preset profiles that are widths that will allow you to adjust those depending. It's probably easier to see it. Let me go back to uniform. And let me change my weight. Let's try to. Yeah, OK. Let me work on the C, because it'll be more obvious. When I go through the profiles here, I can choose to have the ends sharp in that case. If I switch profiles to this one, it's going to start sharp, get a little thinner there, get thicker there in one direction, etc. So you can move through these various width tools, and that can help you customize your particular letters the way that you want them to look. OK, so that's one option. The other thing that we have available to us, let me go back to uniform on this as well, is that we can take this a step further using something called brushes. And we'll go through brushes in a lot more detail when we get to the architectural diagrams section of the class, because then we'll be heavily relying on brushes. But for right now, I can choose brushes. It's available here as long as I'm in Essentials. If we come down, it looks like a little cup with some brushes stuck in it. And right here under brushes, I have one basic brush that's already there. I can choose to load brushes if I go to my little flyout menu and I can say Open Brush Library. And you see that now I have arrows, artistic, vector packs, etc. I'm going to go into artistic, and we'll use, I don't know, let's use the calligraphy brush for right now. So this then opens a bunch of calligraphy brushes. If I were to select my letter here, I could switch to a specific calligraphy brush. Let's see. They're all a little bit large for right now. There we go. There's a 1-point flat. That's a 3-point flat. And you can see that I've then used the calligraphy brush to create that particular letter. If I want to adjust the line weight, I can still select it, go back to my stroke, and right now it's at 1 point. I could drop it. Oops. I can make it thicker. I could say maybe 0.5 if I wanted it to be a little bit thinner. And I can use a calligraphy brush. Likewise, I could use the same brush on this letter and have a different effect, or this letter, and have a different effect there. If I didn't like the calligraphy brushes, I could also use some of the other brush types. So we can come back to brushes here. Let me go ahead and I'll load Open Brush Library. Let's go to Artistic. I could use the ink brushes, for example. And these are a little bit more fluid in their design. But I could, for example, pick something like this, and I get a different look. Now, these are not going to translate perfectly when we do the MyScript font translation. It's looking for very basic letters like these, not something as fancy as this. It may work. It may be OK. The end result is never perfect. And that's what we get for using a free website. If we were really designing a font, we'd use specific software for doing that, and we'd spend a little bit more time. But for our purposes, I just want you to be introduced to these concepts. Okay? So you're more than welcome to play with the brushes. You're more than welcome to play with the width tool available here as well. Once you're done, you're going to go to File and then Export. And you're going to save this, not as an AutoCAD file, but as a JPEG drawing. You could also choose a PNG drawing. Either one is fine. When you click on Save, hold on a second, let me name it differently here. When I click on Save, I want to make sure a couple things. One, my color model is CMYK. Two, my quality is not at 5, but is at maximum, which is 10. I also want to make sure my resolution here is set at 300. And as long as I have 300, 10, and CMYK, I can go ahead and say OK. And it will then export my particular JPEG image. So I already have one that's exported. I'm going to go to the website, myscriptfont.com. There it is. And I'll go ahead and under Upload File, I'll click on the Choose File button. And I'm going to go browse for my file. There it is. I'll go ahead and say Open. I will come down here and I can give it a name. And my output format, I'll leave it as TTF. We have an option of OTF or TTF. It doesn't make any difference which one you pick. I'll go ahead and click on Start. And it will move into this processing thing. And we'll give it a little time. And it should give me a quick little preview. So the quick brown fox jumps. OK, that's good. Then it'll let me download the font. So there it is as a TTF. So I'll go ahead and download that font. It's going into my Documents folder, or my Downloads folder for right now. Now, the other challenge here is to install a font on these computers. It's a little bit more challenging than on your home computer. On your home computer, you could go into your File Explorer. You could go to your Downloads folder. And let me find it, wherever it is. Am I not seeing it? There it is. Okay, and you could double click on it and you should be able to install it. Now on these computers it says, oh wait a minute, you need to have administrator privileges. So we don't have those privileges, so you don't get to install it. Sorry. We do get to see a nice preview of it. That's what it looks like. So in order to install it, we have to do a slightly different method. And I have this written up on the Digital Tools website. If you go under Tutorials, Digital Life, it's called the AMP Font Viewer, which is 0.15. If you're here, there's a direct link to download this portable font viewer file. And so I'll click there, and I'll click on this download button, and then I'll click on external mirror 1, and it's going to start downloading it, we hope. You have to be a little careful on these, because when you click on download, for example, they love to pop up other random stuff that you can download instead. Or if you accidentally click the wrong thing, you can end up downloading other software. Just the nature of the beast here. So in our case, we do want to make sure that we get something called Font Viewer. Assuming that we get that, we're going to have to extract it. So I'll right-click. It comes as a zip file. I'm going to click Extract All, and I'm going to put it on my flash drive. And generally speaking, I would put it in like a resources folder. And maybe in the resources folder, maybe we'll create a software or portable applications, maybe. Oh. Maybe I already have a portable applications because I've already done this. Okay? And we'll extract it into that portable applications folder. I'll go ahead and click Select Folder, and we'll extract. And when it's done, it'll extract, and assuming I said see it, there'll be a little application called Font Viewer. And if we double-click this Font Viewer application, it will show us our system fonts, but it will also allow us to install a font temporarily. So I'm going to click on the tab for Not Installed Fonts, and I'm going to go find my Downloads folder. And actually, it would probably be easier if I put that font onto my flash drive. So let me go ahead and show this. Let me copy it into my OneDrive folder. Let me copy. Nope. 115. There we go. Let me go ahead and paste that in. Actually, today's 114, isn't it? All right, let me go ahead and paste that. There it is. And now in the font viewer, I'm going to go to my flash drive, or in this case, my OneDrive. And I have to keep diving in. So here's my live demonstrations. Here's my 135. There's my exercise 114. And there's my grant font. And it shows up there. So it's a little bit of a pain to go browse for it. Once it's there, though, we have an option for install font temporarily. And so if we click on that, yes, I want to install it temporarily. As long as we leave this application open, my font will be available to me. So it's a temporary way of installing a font. So I've gone ahead and I've done that. The other factor here, though, is I need to not have a piece of software that I want to use it in already open. So if I had InDesign open and I wanted to use this font, I'd have to close InDesign and open it again for it to register. So as part of today's exercise, I want you to download. If I will go to today's exercise, I have an InDesign file. I thought I did. Well, that's annoying. I thought I gave you the InDesign file, but apparently I didn't. So let me quickly do this. I'll update it and put an InDesign file there. I don't know why it's not there. I'm going to copy this just to prove that it works. Let me go ahead and open up InDesign. Maybe. Let me just go to new document here. Create a text box. Let's paste that text in. There it is. And so that you guys can see it a little better, I'll make it a little bit bigger. Then I will take this and I'm going to go up to my font list. And in that font list, I should have Grant Font listed. There it is. And I can then apply my particular font to it. So I just want you to have the process of doing this. Note, for today, creating something with your own font is what I want. But in the future, if you want to install a specific font because you want to use that font, if you went, for example, to one of the free font websites like Font Squirrel, and found a font, oh, I really like this font, you could download this font and install it temporarily on this computer and be able to use it as part of your portfolio or as part of a future design project. There are a few fonts that I will show you guys a little bit later on that are architectural and that I tend to like to use that you can download and use those as well. So we'll use this more than once, but I at least wanted to kind of show you that this option exists. So once we're done, I'll take this image, I'll go to File, Export, and create a JPEG of this. This will be my featured image for my post, but I also want to upload the TTF font itself. So I have a record that I created the font and that here is my font itself. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll turn you loose. Again, I want you to make your way through all of the letters down to this line. If you want to do some or all of the optional characters, you're more than welcome to do it. But those are, again, optional for me as well. But I do want you to get all the way through here. Play around with the width tool and or the brushes if you want to. And then go ahead and upload it to the website, create the font, and prove that it works. Any other questions? All right.